Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Suarez. I'm an associate at Williams & Connolly LLP, and welcome to our panel presentation on the future of socioeconomic school integration. I first have to get off a disclaimer that nothing I say in this reflects on the views of my law firm or its clients, and I will go ahead and introduce our four panelists, or three panelists. First, on my left is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She is a staff writer for the New York Times. And many know about Nicole's work in her 2015 podcast series on This American Life, where she highlighted socioeconomic integration in a truly outstanding podcast and racial integration. And she has written extensively in the Huffington Post, Politico, MSNBC, and many other forums. To her left is Richard Kallenberg. He's a fellow at the Century Foundation. He has sometimes been referred to as the father of socioeconomic school integration. He has written a book called All Together Now, which is available in the South by Southwest bookstore. He's signing it after this if you want to pick that up. And he has really been a thought leader in this area. On his left is Amy McIntosh, and she is the acting deputy, or the acting assistant secretary of education in charge of and overseeing the policy office of the Department of Education. And she has been working extensively in some of the current Obama administration initiatives that relate to socioeconomic integration. So with that, I'd just like to kick off our discussion with Nicole. Nicole, you have done a ton of investigative work over the past few years on integration, and it would be great if you can just sort of provide some context for everyone here about some of the things that you've seen on the ground, some of the challenges you've seen, some of the things that are possibly more positive about integration that you've seen, and just sort of set the stage for everyone here today.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. Very happy to be here and be on this panel with people who have much more expertise than I do. But I have approached this as a journalist who was really looking at the educational landscape and trying to figure out what was happening in schools. I started my journalism career as an education reporter in a majority black school district that was resegregating. And what the national landscape looks like is, in terms of racial segregation, black children in this country are more segregated than they have been at any point since 1972. We are seeing an increasing segregation of black children, but particularly what we're now seeing is a double segregation, where black middle class have been able to escape many of these schools, and what's left behind are schools that are almost entirely black and Latino, and where nearly every student is low income. So what that's also meant is, nationally, we've seen an increase in socioeconomic segregation. So an increase in schools where kids, almost every student is high poverty. I think for the first time nationally, more than half of public school children are now low income. So we're also seeing the flight of middle class parents from public schools in general. With that said, we have resegregation happening, but we also have some communities that have been working, some for decades, some more recently, to try to address that, particularly socioeconomic integration, but also racial segregation. And so there is some hope. We have long-term places like Wake County in North Carolina, which has been busing for socioeconomic integration for several decades, so that program is now kind of being closed out. You have places like I featured in the This American Life piece in Hartford, Connecticut, which was forced by court order to come up with a voluntary desegregation plan in which they've used magnets. I was asked to say about how things were going right, but I'm an investigative reporter, and I'm always looking at what's going wrong. And what I can say is that even in the models, even in the places where there are efforts being made, these efforts are not reaching, most of the time, they're not reaching most black kids. And even where they're reaching large numbers of black kids and now increasingly Latino kids, they're also leaving behind lots of kids. So I don't think that we have found the place that is, Wake County probably is doing it the best, but I don't think we found the place that is, even where they're there's a great deal of integration happening, there still tends to be pockets of schools where every kid is Black, Latino, and poor.
Yeah, so, and Rick, I'd like to pass the next question to you. As Nicole said, there are some glimmers of hope here. Obviously, the situation isn't where we'd want it to be, but there are a lot of skeptics on this issue, as you're well aware, and a lot of your work has focused on the research side of this, whether it's about why socioeconomic integration promotes academic outcome, why it promotes social outcomes, and things of that nature. So it would be great if you can sort of tell everyone a little bit about what the evidence suggests is a good reason to have this sort of integration.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for organizing this. I'm thrilled to be here. I told Nicole privately, and will say now publicly, that I think her This American Life episode and the reporting she has done on this issue has done as much to raise awareness of the problems of segregation as any of us who have been toiling in these fields for a couple of decades. It's a brilliant piece of work, in case any of you haven't heard it. And I'm delighted to be here with Amy as well. Amy and others at the Department of Education have taken a real leadership role on this issue. I think John King, the new acting education secretary, hopefully education secretary soon, has focused more on school integration than any education secretary in decades. So I'm optimistic that we're going to make some real progress here. So Chris, you asked about the evidence on socioeconomic integration. I often say that there is a social science consensus that concentrations of poverty are bad for kids and socioeconomic integration is good. And yet an unfortunate political consensus that there's nothing we can do about it. And I know we'll get into the politics of this in a moment, but on the social science, we've known for 50 years since the famous Coleman report that the biggest predictor of academic achievement is the socioeconomic status of the family that a child comes from. And the second biggest predictor is the socioeconomic status of the school that she attends. That is the socioeconomic status of the classmates. And yet public policy has ignored that finding for many years. Some of you may work in high poverty schools that are doing incredible things, and God bless you for that. The data suggests, however, that those are the exceptions. Middle class schools, those with a majority of students who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, are 22 times as likely to be high performing as high poverty schools, those with more than 50% low income. Now, part of that obviously is because of Coleman's first finding that the socioeconomic status of the family matters a lot. Low income students don't have the same advantages as middle class students do. But when we try to separate those two things, we find that on the National Assessment for Educational Progress in math, in 4th grade, that low-income students who have the chance to go to lower poverty schools are 2 years ahead of low-income students who are in high poverty schools. So it seems to me insane to ignore these findings. One last study I'll mention, Chris, has to do with Montgomery County, Maryland public schools. Because people often say, they look at the NAEP data and they say, well, the low-income kids are doing much better in the middle-class schools, but it may be something special about the families that are particularly motivated to get their kids into high-performing schools. And so Montgomery County, Maryland offered a really unique opportunity to study the effects of socioeconomic integration, setting aside that issue of self-selection. So in Montgomery County, which is right outside of DC, there is an inclusionary zoning program which says when a builder builds a certain number of units, she has to set aside some for low-income students and families. And at the same time, Montgomery County spends, it's a liberal jurisdiction, it spends extra money, about $2,000 extra per pupil, in the higher poverty schools. Now, families are randomly assigned to public housing units in Montgomery County. So we deal with that self-selection issue. And the question becomes, would you rather be a low-income student in a higher poverty school that spends $2,000 extra per pupil for things, good things like reduced class size in the early grades and better professional development for teachers, extended learning time? Or would you rather be a low-income student in a more affluent school that spends less? And Heather Schwartz at the RAND Corporation tracked kids over a 7-year period and found unmistakably that it was an enormous advantage to be in an economically integrated school rather than a higher poverty school. So I think the social science evidence is pretty clear that reducing concentrations of poverty is good for kids, but we now have to address some of the political obstacles.
Thanks, Rick. So Amy, would love for you to sort of build off that and comment on the administration's efforts. In particular, the administration recently announced a $120 million grant program called Stronger Together that is going to be an incentive program for integration. It would be great if you can sort of comment on that, why the administration believes, in light of some of the research Rick highlighted, that this is an important goal for the department, and just some of the other initiatives that the department may be pursuing on this issue.
Thank you, Chris. Is this on? Yes? Okay. So at the Department of Education, we are in the equity business, and we are also trying to be in the what works business. And given the kinds of research findings that Rick just mentioned and the very compelling stories like what Nicole has brought to light, it's very clear that we need to do even more at the federal government to encourage these kinds of, encourage communities that are willing and able to make a difference in socioeconomic integration. So in the President's 2017 budget, we have proposed a $120 million competitive grant program called Stronger Together, which would provide some funding to communities, either districts or groups of districts, who want to undertake the planning and the community engagement to figure out how to start this work. And we will also, through this grant program, fund communities that are partway there and are ready to implement this work. And we imagine that we will spark some more serious talk about controlled choice models, about inter-district transfers that bring kids from affluent in and from less affluent out. We imagine that there could be some smart grade reconfiguration going on where two schools who are, for example, K-5s, one affluent and one not so, restructure to be K-2 and 3-5, and then do all the hard work to make sure that both of those schools are excellent for everyone. So that's what we're hoping to see. We think that it's not the only important initiative that we're doing. We have spent a lot of time in this administration trying to enforce through the civil rights laws all the provisions against discrimination. As long ago as 2011, we put out guidance for use of race in school integration in light of the court cases that have made use of race more difficult. We were very early out there giving guidance and technical assistance to school districts who wanted to either keep the integration they had or further it using other kinds of methods. We're very happy that the new law governing K-12 education, the ESSA law, has picked up some of our administration efforts to create diversity priorities that can go into competitive grant programs. So the new, under ESSA, the Magnet Schools program, which has been about schools that would draw specifically focused on racial integration. We'll also allow socioeconomic diversity, and there are charter programs that are in ESSA also. And so with that, which we worked hard to make sure that the new ESSA law would fulfill the civil rights promise of the original ESEA, we've also put into the President's budget more funding for both the magnet program and the charter school program. So those are some of the examples of what's going on in Washington.
Great, thanks, Amy. And briefly, just wanted to put in a plug for the Slido app. I see that a lot of people are putting up questions, and my next question was actually going to be along the lines of the question that has the most votes right now, which is that obviously school desegregation is an educational issue, and we have a lot of creative solutions to potentially address it. As Amy mentioned, things like controlled choice, where you can rank schools and people receive their preferences, but you take into account the distribution throughout the district. Inter-district transfers, where you transfer students across lines, and magnet schools and numerous other initiatives. But the questioners up on the Slido board highlight the reality that this is not just an education policy issue, and you often hear in education, in the context of desegregation, that housing policy is education policy. So I'd love to hear briefly from each of you sort of your thoughts on the role housing policy has to play on this issue, and how we can be doing things both in education and in the housing context to address this problem. Nicole?
Okay. I've also done a great deal of investigative work in housing segregation and federal, state, and local failures to enforce the Fair Housing Act. So I think clearly a lot of school segregation is resulting from housing segregation and our decision to create neighborhood schools that draw from the communities. And that a lot of the kind of very complicated and sometimes maddening desegregation plans were trying to address housing. They were busing kids across different areas because we either have a great deal of segregation within cities, and then particular to kind of the Northeast and the Midwest, a great deal of segregation between jurisdictions. So segregation in places like New York and Chicago is often accomplished because white people can just move across some jurisdictional boundary into very white school districts. The thing that's interesting about Montgomery County that Richard brought up is it's not a school desegregation program, it's a housing integration program. By placing affordable and often public housing in every community over 50 units, that is how they were able to get integration in the schools, because they were integrating housing. But we're often not talking about these things in the same language. What I will say, though, is a lot of my work is saying that even what schools can control, they're not. So schools can't control housing, and most housing is not under government control, though the government can do a lot better job of enforcing current law. But what schools can't control, they're also not controlling. So even in gentrifying neighborhoods, we're still seeing a lot of segregation. Even in communities, you'll find in some communities, you look at school attendance zone maps, and they are as heavily gerrymandered as legislative maps. And so school districts are often drawing attendance zone lines in ways that segregate schools. They could draw attendance zone lines in ways that integrate schools. So we can't, the schools obviously cannot solve all of the racial problems in this country, but my work is saying that even the things that schools can do, they're often not doing.
I agree with what Nicole has said. This is not either or. We need to address housing segregation and school segregation. And I worry about school districts pointing to housing and saying, throwing up their hands, well, there's nothing we can do. Well, in fact, there are 91 school districts educating about 4 million students, where they've taken steps to affirmatively integrate the schools by socioeconomic status. This is up from 2 school districts when I started researching this issue in the mid-1990s. So there are things that school districts can do. Having said that, I do think we can do a lot more on the housing front. Inclusionary zoning in Montgomery County is one example. I also am working on a new book on housing, and would like to see the creation of a Fair Housing Act for low-income people. So 50 years ago, we passed the Fair Housing Act that outlaws discrimination based on race and national origin and some other categories. And I'm fully supportive of that. It's a fairly weak law. We need to strengthen it. At the same time, Robert Putnam and others have demonstrated that as we've seen a very slow decline in racial segregation by residents, we've seen a fairly dramatic increase in economic segregation. And part of that has to do with exclusionary zoning laws that try to exclude people essentially based on income, also based on race. These are the types of programs where, if you live in a certain neighborhood, you can only build single-family homes. Or, even worse, you have to have half an acre to live in this neighborhood. Now, the market will discriminate based on income, of course. I mean, that's what markets do. Not everyone can afford to buy a house, whatever house they want. But we have government that is affirmatively discriminating against economically disadvantaged people by saying, this entire neighborhood is off limits to you, and the schools that go along with that. So I think housing has to be part of the solution along with school integration.
So I completely agree with everything that's said there. Our competitive grant programs will preference communities that have brought local housing authorities, and by the way, transportation authorities, to the table to try to make sustainable models that can carry on beyond one small grant program. And I have been in rooms in Washington with my colleagues in HUD, in HHS, and in Department of Transportation, where we're trying to do what we can do with the regulatory and grant-making powers that we do have. There is some new regulation and technical assistance and guidance packages around the Fair Housing Act that is just, I think, came out in the fall and does a lot to help communities try to understand the contribution that segregated housing is making to, or how fixing that would improve both economic and educational opportunity. So it's on the radar screen.
So I'm going to direct the next question to Rick. The top question on the board now is about getting parents on board with integration efforts. And Rick, you highlighted the recent Century Foundation report that talked about 91 districts and charters that are pursuing these efforts. In your research and the work you've done, what are some of the things you've seen that have been persuasive to parents to convince them that this is a viable goal and this is something that should be pursued?
So I think in disadvantaged communities and in communities of color, there is a broad recognition that they're getting a raw deal right now and that the economic and racial segregation of schooling is not in their interests. So as a political matter, much of the focus has to be on people who have options. So upper middle class people of all races, but particularly upper middle class white and Asian families. And you mentioned one Century Foundation report. We issued another one at the same time by Amy Stewart Wells at Teachers College Columbia, which makes a very powerful case that if you were to boil it down to a bumper sticker, diversity makes us smarter. That when students come to a school classroom with different life experiences, they all benefit, and that the creative thinking that we want from our students and the critical thinking is enhanced when there's diversity in the classroom. This is something that elite colleges recognized a generation ago, and yet K through 12 educators have not emphasized as much as we all should. So I think making available the evidence that suggests everyone will benefit from diversity is really important. Likewise, in places like Wake County that Nicole mentioned, the political viability of programs is enhanced when parents are educated, but also there are alliances built with with civil rights groups. Reverend Barber in North Carolina was a huge moral voice on dealing with segregation. Importantly, the business community, the Wake County Chamber of Commerce came around to seeing that if they want employees who are going to be able to sell products to people of all different backgrounds and to employees who are going to get along with one another, that diversity strengthens the ability to produce those kinds of employees. The number one reason that people are fired at the workplace is not that they're incompetent. It's that they can't get along with other people. And a big part of that is not being able to get along with people of different backgrounds. So I think there is a latent political coalition out there of parents who recognize the benefits of diversity, business interests, and civil rights groups.
Great. So, Nicole, I'd love you to speak to this, and first I'll comment on it myself briefly. The third question down about socioeconomic being used as a proxy for race, and I think I can speak for most of us on the panel that we all think that racial integration is as important of a goal as socioeconomic integration. The reason that myself in designing the panel chose socioeconomic in the title was because of the legal realities. As a lawyer, you know, there's the parents involved versus community schools decision, which has unfortunately boxed these efforts in such that they must include socioeconomic factors, and race cannot be the sole focus from a legal standpoint. But that being said, we need to acknowledge that both race and socioeconomic diversity is a compelling goal, and it's important in the messaging for people to get behind both the socioeconomic piece and the racial piece. So, Nicole, I'd love for you to share your thoughts on that, that element and sort of how we can advance the conversation so that people focus both on race and socioeconomic status as we address this issue.
Okay, so this is always a point of contention for me because I do feel like, clearly we are using socioeconomic status as a proxy for race, but we know that poverty is racialized and that people in this country of different races do not experience poverty the same way. And so I think first we need to actually center the conversation. We are not talking about diversity as some feel-good, PC thing. Schools integration is about justice and it is about equity. And I think as long as we are framing these conversations about it's nice if you can have it, it produces good workers, we're not actually talking about it in the right way, which is that Brown v. Board was a mandate for equality, it was a mandate for eliminating racial caste, and that is what school integration is about. So I think it is important to understand that even a socioeconomic integration plan is going to leave out a lot of black folks and a lot of brown folks because middle-class black Americans, and to a lesser degree, middle-class Latino Americans are living in poorer neighborhoods than poor white Americans, according to U.S. Census data, and they are more likely to have their kids in schools of concentrated poverty. There are lots of poor white kids in this country, but outside of rural parts of the South and in Appalachia, those kids are actually the most likely to be attending integrated or socioeconomically integrated middle-class schools and are more likely to be living in middle-class neighborhoods than middle-class black and Latinos. So that's always where the rubber hits the road. I agree that there are certain political and legal realities, and this is why we are seeing an embrace of socioeconomic status because it's considered to be race neutral, though it disproportionately impacts, of course, black and Latinos who are more likely to be poor. But I also think that if we cannot skirt talking directly about race and the way that race has been the defining factor in this country. And the reading of parents involved, this is part of what the Obama administration tried to make clear. The Bush administration read that Supreme Court decision as saying you cannot take race into account at all. But if you read the plurality decision written by Justice Kennedy, that's not what it actually says. And it says that school districts, you can't pick and choose one white kid or send a black kid over here. But you certainly can use race. You can use race in where you cite a school. Do you cite a school deeply in a black neighborhood and draw an attendance zone there, or do you cite a school between two segregated neighborhoods? Do you draw attendance zones that might be drawing kids from two very segregated schools? There are ways that we can take race into account. So I think we also need to push in those places that we can. And the last thing I would say is, when Brown v. Board, when the NAACP started challenging school segregation, the case law was settled on this. And the case law was Plessy v. Ferguson that said separate was okay as long as it was equal. And they were making legal challenges when the case law was settled. So I would also say we cannot give up on challenging the current case law and understanding that with a switching of a few justices on the Supreme Court, it is possible that we can once again strengthen school desegregation law, but not if we're not explicitly talking and pushing back when it comes to racial segregation.
Can I add on to that too? Nicole and I were joking beforehand that the panel might get kind of boring if we were all agreeing on everything. So we wanted to make sure that this issue surfaced. It's a really important one. And I would say I'm in 95% agreement with Nicole. I think the PICS decision, this is the Supreme Court decision back in 2007, was wrongly decided. I'd like school districts to be able to use race explicitly as an individualized factor. I think racial integration is independently justified apart from socioeconomic integration. So that's the broad area of agreement. Having said that, there are a couple of reasons I think it's important that I guess I would emphasize socioeconomic integration beyond the legal concern. One is in terms of the research. So going back several years, the research has suggested that what makes a school stronger in terms of what promotes academic achievement is having a socioeconomic mix as opposed to a racial mix per se. So let me explain that. In the 70s, Boston desegregated, and low-income whites and low-income African Americans were integrated, and we saw no achievement gains in Boston. By contrast, in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, in North Carolina, African American students and upper middle class white students were integrated, and we saw substantial achievement gains. And the research makes clear that there's nothing about the pigment of the white kids that somehow benefits African American students. It's rather that economically disadvantaged students do better in schools that are middle class or economically mixed than in high poverty schools, because you want peers who on average are academically engaged, and that tracks by class. You want parents who are in a position to volunteer in class, and that tracks by class. And you want teachers who are well qualified and have high expectations. So to take parental involvement, for example, upper middle class African American parents are just as active in school affairs. They're just as likely to volunteer in class as upper middle class whites. It's the divide is a class divide. And so on the merits, I think there's reasons to want both racial integration and socioeconomic integration. The second reason I'd highlight is a political one. And here, I hate to mention the name Donald Trump in a civilized forum like this, but I've been obsessed for years with Donald Trump's voters before they were Trump voters. White working class people who are siding with quite conservative forces. And Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leader, said, the lower middle income white population in this country is neither liberal nor conservative. It's both, right? And how you define policies will help define how they view the world. And so in Boston, when you had that desegregation by race that mixed low-income whites and low-income African Americans, and had upper middle class whites in the suburbs completely divorced from the whole enterprise, there was resentment from white working class people. If you define this in terms of class instead, so that it was in the interests of white working class people who also don't have great schools to ally themselves with African Americans and Latinos in the fight for better schools through socioeconomic integration, I think there's a chance with some subset of Trump voters. A lot of them are just racist and we'll write them off. But there's some subset who could be appealed to, and I think that framing policies in terms of class can bring them on as allies.
Is this on? Okay. Just to push back a little bit. Plus, it would not be interesting if I didn't. So a few things. There's never been a point in this country where the majority of white Americans have wanted to come up with a racial solution. So I think pointing to politics and the political environment is pointing to the history of our country since the first Africans were brought here in 1619. There's never a right climate to explicitly address race. We didn't have people being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and lynched in the South and beaten in the North trying to desegregate housing because this is what our country wanted. So I get that, but I also feel like we have to think bigger than that. The other thing I would say is so much about integration is now focused on achievement and achievement tests. But Brown v. Board never mentions tests or achievement. What it is about was caste. And we had socioeconomically integrated black schools prior to Brown v. Board. Because if you were black, it didn't matter what your economic status was, you were in the same schools. And those schools simply did not produce the same results. And what we know from the data coming out of the U.S. Department of Ed is the higher the proportion black in a school, the less likely those schools are to get the most rigorous curriculum, to get advanced placement courses, to get the most qualified teachers. That is a racial element that is not going to be transformed because you are mixing poor and middle-class black people in the same schools. We have to be able to use, schools are supposed to be providing equal opportunity, but also full citizenship. That's really what the Brown ruling is about, is ensuring full citizenship of black Americans through the schools. And if we are not working directly on that integration, where a child who is black in a majority white country is able to attend school with the people who hold the power in the country, then I think we're never going to go as far as we should. The last thing I would say is the longitudinal data that is looking at racial integration, not just socioeconomic integration, shows that when black kids, and there's a economist out of Cal Berkeley named Rucker Johnson who looked at data over 2 generations of black kids who went to integrated schools because of a court order. It didn't just change their achievement, it changed their entire trajectory of their lives. So these kids black kids who went to integrated schools were less likely to be poor. They were less likely to go to jail. They lived longer. They were more likely to live in integrated neighborhoods and then to pass that on to their own children and send their own children to integrated neighborhoods. So I think, again, I understand the political realities. I am not a naive person, but I think we really, if we're going to have these discussions, let's really talk about and push for the thing that we know is going to have the greatest benefit. Maybe this is the framework that we can work in now, but I think we have to push further than that.
10 seconds, because I agree with everything. I agree with everything Nicole just said, and to be clear, there's
To have a rap battle now.
no there's 95% of education reform which says integration is, we're not there. We don't care about integration. So our modest difference in emphasis is within this 5% that's focused on integration. So I want to be clear. I think these are interesting issues and there are differences in emphases, but the bigger picture here is that I think we both agree integration is incredibly important by race and socioeconomic status, and we want to figure out ways to move forward on that.
And I think this is a good transition for Amy, and I'm curious how the department is sort of threading this needle. Obviously, in the ESSA, there was a statute passed about the Magnet School Assistance Program to make socioeconomic integration an explicit factor. There are other regulations that use the word socioeconomic. But as Nicole pointed out, the parents involved decision does allow for considerations of race in addition to socioeconomic status. So how is the department sort of striking that balance?
So I actually don't think I can add much to my colleagues. We need racial integration. We need socioeconomic integration. As I said, we're in the equity business. I think the question that is on the top of the list right now about what happens under the new law if there is somewhat more authority around accountability and school intervention, at the state or local level than at the federal level, does that make things more hopeful or less hopeful for the cause that we all care about up here? And the couple of points I would make is the federal government, since LBJ signed the first ESEA law, has been the most firm defender of the case for poor kids and for minority kids. And this law doesn't change that. This law will still make sure that the data that you referenced about longitudinal data about the educational outcomes for poor kids, for black kids, for Hispanic kids is still a requirement and still something that the federal government must do and must make very clear and transparent. So that's one piece of good news. The second thing is the most recent No Child Left Behind law. What is gone from there is not so much the requirement that kids get educational opportunity and be successful regardless of their zip code or their color. What's gone is the very prescriptive consequences and interventions in schools that are not doing that. And none of us are going to miss those very prescriptive one-size-fits-all consequences or interventions. So we'll be in the equity business, we'll be in the measuring and holding accountable for outcomes business. It is true that states and school districts are going to have to care a lot about what choices they make when schools are not delivering for all their kids, and they're going to have to use strategies and interventions that work in their local context. The good news is there are a number that we've mentioned up here that could advance socioeconomic integration and racial integration, and we don't need any other change to federal policy. My boss, the acting secretary, when he was commissioner in New York State, used federal dollars under the old law to advance the cause of socioeconomic integration in New York State. That can be done. States and school district leaders will have to have some political will. I know that the civil rights community in Washington, given the change to the new ESSA, is looking hard at how they can have more impact at the state and local level. We desperately, desperately need that. We need, 50 of all the people who come to Washington and advocate for civil rights. We need them in every state. And we need more evidence about what works. I mean, what we do know doesn't work when schools are failing. What doesn't work is little incremental changes, more professional development, or one new piece of curriculum. Things have to change when schools are failing, and one way to change things is to disrupt the enrollment patterns that have left concentrated poverty.
So one of the questions up here highlights another sort of challenge to integration efforts that I'd love for any of you to chime in on at your leisure. The question talks about special ed and how future moves can combat the overrepresentation of low-income students of color in these spaces. I'd like to sort of broaden the question to just sort of the general challenge that when many schools become integrated, the tracking within the schools, particularly at the secondary level, will sometimes perpetuate segregation within a supposedly integrated school. So whichever of you is interested, I'd love to chime in on that particular issue.
Could I just specifically comment on the special ed issue? The department is undertaking a regulatory process right now to try to make the rules against disproportionate identification of any group but minorities into special ed, disproportionate discipline where black kids are suspended or expelled disproportionately. So we have a regulatory process in the works now, and comment on that is needed and welcome so that we can strengthen some of the equity rules around that.
Great question, whoever asked it, and I like the way you broadened it, Grace. Having integrated school schools without integrated classrooms only get you half as far as you need to be. And I think there's a lot of there are a lot of exciting things being done in the charter school sector to experiment with how to really capitalize on diversity and make sure that all students benefit from it. My colleague Hallie Potter and I have a new book out called A Smarter Charter, and we talk about the fact that charter schools, for the most part, are actually more segregated than traditional public schools, which is a really hard thing to be. And yet there are a subset of charter schools that are doing a great job of not only consciously bringing together a socioeconomically and racially diverse population, but then figuring out how to take the next step and make sure that not only that tracking doesn't occur, but that all members of the community feel valued, including the parents, and that the diversity in the classroom is taken advantage of. And they do all sorts of innovative things, such as making sure that there are opportunities for students of different racial and economic groups to get together on the weekends, to come together as equals, and to learn from one another through activities that are often based around food or something that's attractive to people. Those are the kinds of experiments that the charter school movement was supposed to be involved in, and I'm glad that there are a small number of charter schools that are really addressing not only tracking but how to make sure that we get the most from diversity. And
this is for all of you. What are some things, given the climate around this issue and sort of reinvigoration of the issue of late to some extent, that young people can do to address this issue, keep it on the radar, and keep people focused on it and advocate for it?
So I was here yesterday, and there was a panel here about people in the EdTech world like a lot of people out there, making sure that as we expand the ways we can use technology in education, we make sure that EdTech is an enabler of social justice and of advancement for low-income and minority kids. So that is one thing that this audience can do. Clearly, being involved in your political processes at the local, state, and federal level is critically important. Our budget request doesn't become a budget until Congress passes it. It's certainly the same in most states and districts, and it's citizens who make sure those things happen. And then finally, what do you want for your own kids? Think about that and try to make sure that that comes about in a way that will give your kids the kinds of skills and opportunities that these two have talked about, so important in the future.
So I'm a baby boomer, and the baby boomers blew this. As Nicole said, our schools are more segregated than practically before the civil rights revolution, but I have some modest hope that millennials are in a better position on this issue. There's certainly research to suggest that millennials are more interested in living in diverse urban neighborhoods than those in the past. And there's evidence to suggest that a growing number of millennials are recognizing that as our nation's demographics change broadly, that their own children will be better equipped to navigate and flourish and celebrate the diversity if they go to diverse schools. So I think those are a couple of the promising things that we're seeing. And so now it becomes an issue of people in this room and elsewhere taking the evidence out to the public and into the schools to really help transform us. I know, Nicole, you're a little more pessimistic than I am on this issue, but I've just seen that we've gone from almost no discussion of it, to a real recognition that if we want to be stronger together, that we have to make sure that children from different backgrounds are learning from one another. And I think there's some modest reason for optimism.
So I will play my usual role as the downer on every panel that I'm on. I actually was just looking at a study the other day about whether millennials' racial views were any better than ours and the generation before, and the answer is actually that they're not. And it's funny, I'm a lay historian in all of my work. I do a lot of historical research, and I was reading something from like 1970, and the exact same thing that we say now is what they said then. We just have to wait for the older generation to die off, and this race problem will be fixed. But then the younger generation becomes the older generation, and without some sort of disruption, the system is self-replicating. So we have this thing that Gunnar Myrdal called the American dilemma, which is that Americans believe our core value is equality of opportunity, and that every person, no matter what their lot in life, no matter what their race, deserves the same opportunity. We believe in that equality, but our actions are very different. The personal actions that we take are very different. So I live in New York City, which is probably one of the most liberal cities in this country, and it also has the most segregated schools in this country, and it has the third most segregated neighborhoods in this country. So this is not a problem of people who are rabidly racist. This is not a problem of people who don't believe in integration as a belief system. It is a problem of people who are willing to accept, in a competitive school system, trying to earn whatever advantages they can get for their own children, and taking those advantages and, kind of being sad about the disadvantages of other kids, but not being willing to give anything up to make things equal. And then, clearly, race is at the center of all of this. And what we know is that the diversity that white Americans are willing to accept, particularly when it comes to living around black people and putting their kids in schools with black children, is very low. It's actually quite low. And so people want a managed diversity, but not necessarily the type of integration that would be required to make the system equitable. So I actually don't know where we go. Because I'm often looking at the work and trying to figure out, we're trying to get around this thing that is embedded in the very DNA of our country, which is a belief that when you hear the way we talk about schools, if the school has a lot of black kids, it's not safe. It can't be, the education you get there cannot be as good. There is a great deal of fear, and I don't know how exactly we get past that fear. I was looking at a study out of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. It was Roz Mickelson, or actually it might have been Amy Stewart Wells, sorry, I think it wasn't out of North Carolina. But it showed that when parents were looking at data and they were looking for schools, they say that test scores were the most important thing, but what they actually selected the schools on was the racial demographics of the school. So even if you had heavily black schools with better test scores than heavily white schools, they were picking that school based on race, despite what they were saying, which is that test scores and school environment were the most important issues. So I'm not sure how we get past that. I don't think we've ever really gotten past that. And we're not going to address this until we somehow figure that out, until we somehow realize that all of these are our citizens and our fellow Americans. All of these children really, like your kid is actually not better than anyone else's kid. Last thing I would say, a little bit hopeful, a little bit. It hurts me to be hopeful, but a little bit. As I was looking at some data from the Pew Research that was showing like the attitudes of white Americans, and a year ago, and really for probably a couple of decades, most white Americans did not think that race was a big issue that we needed to address, and that we didn't need to, and actually, just last year, a majority of white Americans felt that they were more discriminated against than black Americans. But there's been a shift, a profound shift, just in the last year, largely I think because of the Black Lives Matter movement, where now a majority of white Americans actually think race is a big issue and that we do need to address inequality among black Americans. That's huge. So on the one hand, I am very pessimistic, but on the other hand, or I would say a realist, on the other hand, we are at a point where we are talking about integration for the first time in a long time. And white Americans, at least in this polling, are more open to understanding that we still have a lot more work to do. So if we have some good leadership around this, if we are able to build coalitions, I think what made Wake County, I'm sorry, I'm talking very long, I'll wrap this up. What made Wake County work was not just that business people believed that diversity was good for business. There was an understanding that once you have created school districts where no white people want to send their kids to school, you have a hard time recruiting people to even come and work in your community. And Wake County realized that you shouldn't have pockets of your community where no one will move and no one will send their kids, because that's actually a very inefficient and challenging way to run a city. Most of us have just been willing to accept that we're going to have these pockets of opportunity, and everyone, and it actually hurts everyone, because then people who want to move into those good schools are having to pay all of this extra money to get into these very few good schools. And when you even that all out, it actually benefits the whole community. I just think we have failed to realize and capitalize on that because we haven't had the leadership around it.
So just continuing to think about how we can sort of maybe end on a hopeful note. There are clearly pockets of the United States, as we talked about multiple times, the 91 districts you highlighted in the report, Jefferson County, Wake County, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Hartford, Connecticut. There are numerous places where integration efforts are ongoing. There must be something in the DNA in those places, something in the culture that perhaps is sustaining those efforts more than the non-existence of efforts in various other parts of the country. So, what do we all on this panel think are sort of the cultural factors that have perhaps allowed us to have some progress in this area? Not the amount of progress we'd want, but some progress. And which of those cultural factors can we perhaps harness to sort of encourage folks to embrace this issue as we continue in the 21st century? So.
So I'm not sure I agree with the premise, because if you look at the 91 districts, and my colleagues Hallie Potter and Kimberly Quick have this in their report, they have a map that shows there actually are school integration efforts going on, socioeconomic school integration efforts going on in red states and blue states. It's not just, my instinct would be to say, you need a liberal population like one found in Berkeley or Cambridge, both of which do have socioeconomic plans. But it goes way beyond that. I think it has to do with the approach that is taken. So we're not talking about compulsory busing from several decades ago. No one's really doing that. Instead, in a number of districts, there are a variety of options provided. There's universal choice, so you don't get this inequity where only the most motivated families or the ones who have access to information apply, but everyone applies to a school, and every school has something distinctive to offer. A magnet approach, a pedagogical approach, a theme that will appeal to not everyone, but to a subset of parents who will be willing, therefore, to send their children to a different area of the city because there's a promising program at the end of the road. So I think it's one of these rare instances where you can use a market mechanism for the public good. Normally, those two things, I think, are divorced. But in this case, there have been the effective school districts are those that have married choice with fairness. So it's not just unregulated choice, but choice that has these positive draws and fairness guidelines to ensure that choice results in integration. And if I can just say one more optimistic thing, which is kind of drawn from pessimism, I guess. I think part of the reason we're seeing focus on school integration is that existing efforts of school reform, which almost universally try to make separate but equal work, like they're back in the Plessy category, I think they've been frustrating to people. We've seen small pockets of excellence, but for the most part, that strategy hasn't been working. And so you have Diane Ravitch on the left and Michelle Rhee, the former chancellor of DC Public Schools, on the right, both saying we've got to deal with this issue of school segregation and move forward. So in a perverse way, it's the limitations of existing efforts that I think will push us toward finally embracing more robust efforts to try to integrate our schools.
Well, and if you want to get involved in this issue, just want to end on a note that there are cards at the center of all of your tables. And encourage you to fill those out if you want to hear more about this issue. I'd like to take a moment to thank our panelists. Thanks so much. You all did an excellent job, and I'd like to thank the Walton Foundation for their sponsorship of this event, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.